Welcome, everybody. I am ready to continue reviewing the Eric Sampson video. We'll finish this one up. I think I'll get through this a little quicker, and then we'll go back to Alex O'Connor and the Sam Harris discussion, and I'll cover that one. I still got other stuff to be doing on this channel besides just reviewing videos. I know I've been doing that a lot lately, but we'll eventually get back to other stuff. Plan is still to do at the AMA, to do a few shorts where I like, 5 or 10 minute videos where I discuss I guess not like shorts officially, like, shorter videos where I cover topics in a more compressed form. Good exercise for me instead of these 2 or 3 hour streams. What else? I'll be looking to do more debates. If you haven't seen my discussion with Mike Humer, you could go see that on Curiosity Guy's channel. It's almost hit 7,000 views. So it's probably one of the videos where I've got the most views in the shortest amount of time. So all kinds of stuff, want to set up other debates. I did post in the community section, man, I hate that, the random coughing when I'm trying to talk. Excuse you, throat. Don't make me cough. So lots of stuff to do, but for now, I'm sticking with the reviewing videos. So there's still more going on in the blog too. You'll be seeing some stuff over there. Yeah, so we got stuff going on. Let's see. Let's say hi to the chat. Matt, I think I got to follow the Nathan rule, which is to say, if you comment before the live goes live, it doesn't count for Lance Loot. I got to start being consistent with that. So no Lance Loot for you. So that means Anthony D. Simone gets 1,000 Lance Loot. Egor says hello, gets 500 Lance Loot, and Harmonica Luke gets 250 Lance Loot. Stands to reason. Good to see you. Anthony, is this your first time here? I've been using this. That's like trying to hit. Okay, there we go. There's a delay. Anthony, is this your first time being here? I've been using that intro for a while. I know it's a pretty simple one, but I'm happy with it. And we got Mason saying, good evening, everybody. Is that a picture of Jupiter? Looks like it. Jupiter's cool. All right. So let's just get into it. I don't have any big preamble to talk about. So we are about the 37-minute mark. Let's see. Oh, I closed out the video that I was about to review. Let me go find it, and then we will get back to reviewing it. Very ridiculous of me, but all right. There, yeah. All right. Matt says it's a stance-independent moral fact that you ought to give me Lance Loot. Yeah, well, I don't abide by stance-independent moral facts, so I don't particularly care if it's a stance-independent fact. Too bad, you're not getting any this time. Wait until next time. You were ready, so you just had to wait until after the intro video. Once you see my face, that's the moment that Lance Loot counts. All right, and Mason confirmed that it is in fact Jupiter. If anyone's listening, they're not going to know what the heck I'm talking about. All right. So I don't really know where we left off. So I'll start at about like a minute before. So let's roll it back a bit, just so I know what the heck is going on. I'm not hearing any audio. There we go.
In virtually no domain do people think you can reduce it to like a series of 1 or 2 principles. It's just silly because the reality that you're trying to think about is just way too complicated. I think, yeah, that's true of the moral domain as well. That at best, what we can do is some general rules of thumb and identifying reasons for and against various things, but there's not going to be anything like a systematic theory that we could fit in our heads that accurately describes what you morally ought to do and ought not to do.
Mm-hmm. And this may tie in and may even support the idea of indirect normativity as a means of trying to get AI to not necessarily act on or be motivated by a set of direct specifications. But we'll talk about this a bit later. I just wanted to tease that we are going to talk about this in the context of AI safety a little bit later. And it seemed to be a good opportunity to sort of link this point in. All right. So, okay.
All right. So before they get started on the next topic, I did pin an article, I think it came out today, from Nathan Orman, Digital Gnosis, over on Substack. He's moved over to Substack recently, called, quote, Intuition Talk. Yeah, it did come out today. I love the article. I thought there was lots of great stuff in there. There's also some pretty funny stuff. So Nathan proposes phenomenal communism to, I guess, coincide with phenomenal conservatism, and I found I thought there was a good mix of some amusing commentary in there, but also some I think helpful insights into discussion about phenomenal conservatism and intuition. The one place I think people could push back and perhaps should push back is that in at least some cases, someone can report that something might seem to them to be the case, but also report that they nevertheless don't think it's the case. And so this might not be like where if something seems to you the case, then you believe it's the case, and if something believes that it's if you believe something is the case, then it seems to you that it's the case. It could be that if you believe something is the case, it may very well seem to you that it is, but not vice versa. But even that, I think, could be challenged. Some people could say, look, it really doesn't seem to me like this is the case, but I believe it anyway. I don't know what's going on with it. In other words, basically, it may not be that belief entails seeming or that seeming entails belief. And I think that Nathan was taking it that when people are reporting these seemings, a lot of times they're just basically saying what they believe. I don't know if the phenomenology works out that way. I think that the issue may be more basic than that, which is that people are reporting that things seem to them a certain way, but that might be a hodgepodge of different types of phenomenological, like the experiences might differ from one person to another, from one experience to another, and they may or may not map onto or bear any specific relation to beliefs. They may not pick out any distinct psychological states or categories or kinds or whatever at all. So I think a lot of this is just sort of underdeveloped, almost pseudo-psychology when philosophers talk about things seeming to be a certain way. So I think the issues might be more fundamental, but it's still a great article and it's worth checking out. So that was an aside. Anyway, let's get back to this particular video. Wrong place.
Well, setting the stage for why people should favor moral realism over other metaethical stances, what does moral realism solve or make simpler to solve than other metaethical theories? They may struggle with simplicity. Does your view on moral realism, account, like, can you say, okay, well, does it give you credence levels and say, okay, you can act like this and it'll give you like a 95% likelihood that you're going to end up with a moral result? Is that permissible? Would you say acting based on credences within moral realism framework that you hold permissible?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, the sense in which I think like we can never be sure of anything is just the sense that like you can never be certain that you got it right. I mean, as long as there's a reality independent of your mind, there's always room for doubt that your mind is in fact getting a grip on the reality, that you're not subject to some sort of distorting influences or something like that. But all the same, I mean, just as in like, with the physical world, like I guess there's at the end of the day, no guarantee that I'm not in the matrix, but I'm pretty sure I'm not in the matrix. I'm like, virtually certain. I'm not certain that I'm not in the matrix, but I'm virtually certain. So I guess I think that about moral reality. And now the question is like, well, what like moral truths can you, know with a high degree of confidence? And I guess I think there are some that, you can be pretty confident in, like, would it be morally wrong for me to plow through a bunch of pedestrians on my way to work to just get to my parking spot a little faster than I ordinarily would? I think that's a central case. Like, yeah, I know that I definitely know that that's wrong. What about like abortion? Is that wrong? That's harder because it depends on, more complicated factors. But so that was just to say, like, what you want to do in moral inquiries, you want to start with the central cases that you can be really highly confident of. And you want to begin trying to systematize those and then work toward the outer reaches to the more complicated cases like abortion and I don't know, whatever else, genetic enhancement or whatever the thing you're arguing about is.
I do wonder whether intuitions are up to the task of addressing this issue. So proponents of ethical intuitionism may feel fairly comfortable saying, look, ethical intuitionism at least gives us insight into the fact that like wanton slaughter of children is morally wrong, or, peeling someone's skin off and turning it into a lampshade just for fun is morally wrong. Like really cases that most sane people, or maybe all sane, normal humans would like agree to. Yeah, sure, we all have those attitudes that those things are horrific and terrible. But in the moment you actually run into moral issues that anyone actually cares about because they're actually controversial, how do we navigate that by appeal to our intuitions? I think you're immediately going to run into this problem of disagreement. Now, this is often leveraged as some sort of argument against moral realism, and often it's presented something like this. Well, hey, people disagree about like normative moral issues. Some people think abortion is right. Some people think it's wrong. And people will simply, this is often characterized as you simply point to the existence of disagreement as an indication that there is no stance independent set of moral facts, as if the mere presence of disagreement should somehow prompt that inference. And the pretty straightforward response to this is people disagree about the shape of the earth, people disagree about scientific matters, people disagree about mathematics. In none of those cases would that be taken to be a particularly strong indication that there's no stance independent facts in those domains. I agree with that. I don't think a sort of standard argument from disagreement has much argumentative or traction. It doesn't have much dialectical force. What I think people can do when they point to this disagreement isn't to point to the existence of disagreement and then say, therefore moral realism falls. What they could do is gesture towards that and then say, okay, well, given that there are these disagreements, we have some important questions to ask about how we could resolve these disagreements in principle. What are the methods or tools we could use to resolve these disagreements? And if the answer to that is unsatisfactory, we're faced with an epistemic challenge. That wouldn't be a direct challenge to moral realism, because the moral realist could say, look, maybe we don't have the right methods yet. Maybe we haven't stumbled across the right methods. Maybe there's some problem, like some sort of epistemic access problem that is a sort of practical problem. We just need to get our epistemology straight, and then the problem would be solved. Again, I just agree with that. Like it's not like if there's an epistemic barrier to accessing the moral facts that we face as a practical problem, that doesn't rule out that the possibility that we could devise one or something like that. So the kinds of challenges that I think one can propose in these cases are at least fairly limited. You could build on these arguments even further by saying, okay, well, what if we take cases of epistemic peers? We have people that are epistemically very well situated. They're aware of all the facts and they still disagree. And that might start to make us wonder whether maybe the reason they disagree is because there isn't any definitive fact of the matter. Those are hard cases to judge, though, because someone could always look at this from the outside and think that, well, one of these people, maybe they're not really peers. Maybe if you stipulate two people are epistemic peers and they disagree, okay, well, that's a hypothetical. In any actual instance, do we know that there's two people that are genuinely in possession of all the relevant non-moral considerations and nevertheless persist in disagreeing? And that, I'm not sure, because it could be that you could say, okay, well, maybe one of them has some sort of, weird aberration in how they think. There could always be some prosaic explanation for why apparent epistemic peers could persist in disagreement, even though there is a fact of the matter. It's just that the more you ratchet up the persistence of the disagreement, so disagreement between totally uninformed people, not a big threat. Disagreement, among reasonably well-informed people, okay, a little bit more of a threat. Disagreement, very persistent disagreement over a very long time among exceptionally competent people that are both, or the two groups are extremely confident that they're all equally in possession of all the facts. Now we have some, now there's some concerns here. Now again, is any of this dispositive? Does any of this settle the matter about whether, hey, there really isn't a means of acquiring knowledge of the moral facts? No, but it could start to push up against some sort of inductive case that, hey, we've had a long enough time, we've had enough experiences, we've had enough disputes about this, we still don't agree. Maybe it's time to throw in the towel and consider that maybe the reason we don't agree is that there isn't anything in particular to agree about. Again, though, I don't personally find those kinds of arguments particularly persuasive, in large part because I think human beings can be super stubborn and intransigent and irrational and entrenched in their views and really committed, even if there is some fact of the matter. So it might be that you could never convince people that souls don't exist, or you could never convince people that, some event that, maybe a person really hates somebody and they think that they did something terrible, no matter what evidence you present. People could just be incorrigible for completely mundane psychological reasons. And so I wouldn't want to settle disputes about whether moral realism is true or not on the basis of contingent facts about the incorrigibility of human beings. I don't take that to be a particularly compelling line of argument. So arguments from disagreement, I think they might do a little bit of work, but they don't do a whole lot. And I don't personally appeal to them. It's interesting given that often what will happen when I make my case for anti-realism is that people will try to ratchet the sorts of things I say into standard arguments. So I've seen people in comments online say, what Lance is saying, this is just another version of the argument from Disagreement. No, it's not. I don't make arguments from Disagreement. So a lot of people will try to match arguments or metaphors or allegories or the sorts of points that I make onto existing arguments and then say, yeah, this is a version of that. This is a kind of that. And that's often just not the case. All right.
So did you want me to answer the question about what problem does realism solve?
But that's interesting what you just brought up. And you brought up examples which are quite controversial. I come from a bit of a transhumanist scene. I've been on the World Transhumanist Association board. I interviewed, one of my most popular videos is with Nick Bostrom, an interview on the simulation hypothesis and the argument. I certainly am on the side that we're not in a simulation, most likely, but yes, there's some degree of likelihood that we are. Mm-hmm. But the question I asked before I started talking about credences was, what does moral realism solve or make simpler to solve than other meta-ethical theories?
I guess I want to say, well, I think you should be a realist, but not necessarily because it solves any problems, unless you just conceive of theorizing a certain domain as a problem that you want to solve, and realism does the best job of doing it. So I wouldn't want to say this will solve some problem that you have. Instead, I just think it makes the most sense of the moral domain that we're trying to understand. So most of us, when we're thinking about, when we're trying to theorize morality, we come to it first, and we're hit with what you might call data. That is just
I can already tell you in advance, I'm going to have, this is like the Bingson, Schaffer-Landau, Cuneo approach, this idea that we have data. I really, really do not like the way that they describe this as data, because it seems to me to borrow sort of a quasi-scientific terminology. It borrows some of the gravitas of science for a methodology that is in no way scientific. That doesn't mean that the methodology is thereby wrong or misguided or bad, but I don't like prestige leeching. Science is really successful, so let's use similar terminology as the science is. Now, they might object that it is data and it's perfectly appropriate to call it data. Okay. I mean, maybe, but there is a question. One of my biggest issues with the way they frame things is, how do we determine what the data is? Because a lot of what it looks to me like they've said is the data is just stuff that I don't consider to be data. I don't take it as the facts that we've intersubjectively agreed upon that are now in need of explanation. It's no, I don't consider those facts in need of explanation. If you think those are the facts, I'd like to see the data that supports that this is the data. What if I say the data is that there's lots of studies that show the Earth isn't round or something like that? It would be there isn't data of that kind. That's ridiculous. I hope this channel doesn't get something about the Earth not being round on it now, because I don't endorse that at all. But the point would just be, people can dispute what the data is, and I had the impression that they seem pretty confident that they know what the data is. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself because I'm talking about people that aren't in this conversation. So I'll talk about that when I review their work at some point.
Things that it seems reasonable to believe about the domain. And then once you sort of get a grip on some of the data, on some of the things that it's reasonable to believe about that domain, then you begin to try to theorize it. And so I think realism does the best job of vindicating many of our pre-theoretical thoughts about morality. And it does.
Yeah, so stuff that it's reasonable to believe, and it vindicates many of our pre-theoretical thoughts. Again, I'm gonna have to print out T-shirts or get a tattoo, on my arm or something that's who is us, who is we, who is our. Moral realism does a horrific job of explaining my pre-theoretical intuitions, and also note that term.
Some of the things that it's reasonable to believe about that domain, then you begin to try to theorize it. And so I think realism does the best job of vindicating many of our pre-theoretical thoughts about morality.
Our pre-theoretical thoughts. Which pre-theoretical thoughts does it vindicate? Which ones? Because I would have thought that our pre-theoretical thoughts, like what the content of those pre-theoretical thoughts are. Think about this. He's talking about thoughts. Which field studies thoughts? Could say philosophy, but there's a field that specializes in studying this stuff, and that's psychology. And if you want to know what people's pre-theoretical thoughts are, you'd have to do empirical research. And as I'm very fond of repeating over and over and over, because apparently, people are not reacting to the empirical research in this. To the extent that empirical research has been done on the question of whether non-philosophers tend to be inclined towards moral realism or anti-realism, there is virtually no indication that people are overwhelmingly, systematically, or consistently inclined towards moral realism in virtually any population that's been sampled so far. So you might sometimes get some people that are inclined towards realism to some extent, but you often just don't get that. Now, a lot of the early studies, people gave like mixed responses. They would give a realist-like response and an anti-realist-like response to different moral issues. Some people have said, that's evidence that people are realists because as long as you think there's at least one sense independent moral fact, then you're a realist. Part of the problem with that is that the way in which psychological measures are done is that, philosophical categories can be neat and discrete and clean, but psychological measurement is often a very messy affair. So you can imagine, if I gave someone 100 questions that all were like a 5-point Likert scale. So 1 strongly disagree, 5 strongly agree. And the 100 questions were all designed to measure belief in God. So let's say, 5 means very strong belief in God. 1 means very strong disbelief in God, right? And so like 3 would be the midpoint. It's like a neutral. It doesn't tell you one way or the other. What if a person gives answers that are almost entirely composed of 1s, 2s, and 3s, but there's like 6 or 7 5s or 4s? So, imagine you set the bar as if even 1 response out of the 100 is higher than a 3. Hey, they chose at least 1, so they believe in God. You might discover that 98% of the population are theists by that standard. Why? Well, measures are noisy. Sometimes people misinterpret a question, or they're inattentive, or they interpret it in a way that is different from researcher intent, or they think about it in a variety of ways that are not especially or perfectly diagnostic of their views. It's if you imagine there's the bullseye, which is the correct measurement, all these very sloppy measures, everything has to be filtered through language and through the psychology of the participants in your studies. When people are responding to those questions, some of their responses they're not going to respond in the way that you expect. It's not like people are perfectly all interpreting things the same as one another or in line with researcher intent. So if you ask 100 questions that you intend to be measures of belief in God, you might very well get some responses below the midpoint, like the neutral point, indicating disbelief in God, and some responses above the midpoint, indicating that they do believe in God. And if we had like a God's eye view to know their true belief, if the person gave 95 disbelieve and 5 believe, we could look down at that and say, yeah, that person doesn't believe in God. So, maybe they respond to a question about there being great, a measure that's supposed to measure belief in God. And it's like, there's a higher power. And if you ask the person, like, what do they mean by higher power? They could say, oh, well, I just think that everybody has some sort of, there's some sort of abstract sense that we all share, that there's something greater than ourselves. And it's ineffable and inarticulable, but it's not a being. It's not a God. It didn't create the universe. Okay. So that might've been used by researchers as an indicator of belief in God, but the person didn't interpret it that way. And so it's not really an indicator that they believe in God. So when you look at a lot of these early studies like Goodwin and Darley 2008, you present people with various disagreements, and they will judge that 2 people could both be correct in some of them, and then at least 1 person must be incorrect in others. Okay, so it looks like they give a realist response to some and an anti-realist response to the other. What you got to look at is why they responded that way. And a lot of the cases, if you actually look at, because this is exactly what I did, their answers to these cases, they are very hard to interpret as any sort of clear indication that the person has a realist view or an anti-realist view. Now, there are a lot of methodological problems with those early studies, and some research has responded to this by trying to minimize the presence of the more significant methodological problems with some of those early studies. Polzer and Wright's anti-realist pluralism is one of the most prominent among these. There's a handful of others. What do they find in the new studies? They actually found, at least in populations on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, it's an online survey platform where people are paid small amounts of money to fill out surveys, and among, I think it's University of Charleston, I think they said, college students that filled out these surveys. In those 2 populations, they found very high rates of consistent anti-realism, where people gave anti-realist responses to all or nearly all of the sorts of questions that they were given. Now, again, if you're giving people 6 measures and each one contains a bunch of submeasures or something like that, so you have multiple chances, and the bar is if they give any answers one way out of a dozen or 30 questions or 50 questions, automatically realism wins, and they give none as long as they have to give absolutely none. That's the only condition in which they're an anti-realist. That's setting such an extreme bar. If you're familiar with the way that this kind of data is measured, that it would not be reasonable to interpret anyone that picks at least one as a realist. It just wouldn't be reasonable. In any case, you still get very high rates of people basically never picking their realist responses. I don't know the exact percentage that never pick them, but it just sometimes people want to set that bar really low. That bar is also really confusing for a number of other reasons. Typically, when philosophers say you're a realist if you think there's at least one stance-independent moral fact, that at least one is simply an indication that realism is constituted by there being some minimum threshold of at least like one unit in the domain. So for instance, your unicorns exist if there's at least one unicorn. So there's got to be at least one. There could be 50, there could be a trillion, but if there's one unicorn, then unicorns exist. If there's one moral fact, then moral facts exist. And so someone might reason if a person believes that there's one moral fact, then stance-independent moral facts exist. Fine, let's grant that. But the question is, when you're looking at a person giving a response to 50 questions or 30 questions, and they give a realist response to one question out of 50, so they gave 49 consistent anti-realist responses and one response that's a realist response. Does that mean the person thinks, like, do we just interpret all of those in a flat-footed way at face value and say, so this person is a relativist or an anti-realist of some kind about most moral issues, but they're a realist about this particular one? That's one way of interpreting it. And that is how some researchers interpret it. That's metaethical pluralism. They're realist about some things, anti-realist about others. I'm fine with saying if you're genuinely a realist about some things and an anti-realist about others, then you're a realist. That's fine. Because it's like if, hey, I don't believe in these gods, but I do believe in those gods. Okay, then you're a theist. Fine. The question is whether we should actually interpret someone that is mostly consistently choosing anti-realist responses and occasionally chooses realist responses as actually being an anti-realist about some issues and a realist about others, rather than that person having no determinate position or being an anti-realist that kind of interpreted some of the questions in a funny way. I don't actually think people are anti-realists either. What I actually think is going on is people don't really interpret these questions the way researchers intend for them to interpret them, because they don't really have concepts of realism and anti-realism. That's a separate question, and it's very complicated to explain why. But when Sampson makes these sorts of claims, I take these, we have this empiricist dilemma. If these are not empirical claims, it's very strange. It's very obscure what you could possibly be saying if you're saying, hey, there are facts about people's like pre-theoretical thoughts, but facts about their thoughts are not in any way empirical. Again, I'm not saying Sampson says that, but that would be a weird position to take, that facts about the thoughts that people have and the proportion of people that have one thought rather than another, something like their beliefs rather than their other beliefs. Like imagine saying facts about the percentage of people that believe in Christianity are not empirical questions. It's like an a priori question. That would be absurd. So I take it to be the only non-absurd option here is that these are empirical questions. And is Sampson going to present any empirical data? As far as I know, I don't think he does. There is empirical data on this, and it does not support the conclusion that most people's pre-theoretical intuitions or thoughts favor moral realism. There is virtually no empirical evidence to support that. That's not to say there aren't studies where the authors interpret their data that way, or there's people that argue that the data suggests that. This is a contentious matter, and I'm open to contending it. So if someone disagrees with me about what the data shows, get in touch. I'd be happy to have you on the channel and talk to you about it, because that's my bread and butter. I don't think the data shows that people are realists. Again, though, I don't think it shows they're anti-realists.
And it does so in a way that doesn't make us, commit us to ghosts or anything too weird. Of course, many people think, morality is super duper weird, but I guess I think once you get a sense of like what we're saying morality is like, we're not saying that there are platonic forms out there that you're getting a grip on, or that.
To be fair, some people are saying that. So at least some of them are.
They're little invisible properties that are sitting on top of your actions, rightness and wrongness, or something like that.
Some people think that too. So, not everybody does, but some philosophers might think things like that.
That have like physical properties, but you just can't see them.
Oh, well, not too many philosophers are going to think that. I think T-Jump holds a view like that, but I don't know of too many academic philosophers that hold a position like that, like moral particles or something.
What sort of data does realism make sense of? Well, I think it just makes sense of the idea, first of all, that there are things that are right and wrong. It seems.
Hold on. So moral realism, the view that there's stance independent moral facts, makes sense of. Wait, what exactly did he say?
So, what sort of data does?
So, what's the data we're working with here? These are the facts that we need to account for.
Realism make sense of? Well, I think it just makes sense of the idea, first of all, that there are things that are right and wrong.
So, the belief that there's stance independent facts about what's morally right or wrong makes sense of the data which is the thought that there are things that are right or wrong. How is the thought that there are things that are right or wrong data? Is it the belief? Maybe he means belief. So people believe there's things that are right or wrong. Realism makes sense of that. Does he mean right or like? So is realism the view that there are stance independent moral facts about what's morally right or wrong? Is that making sense of the data that people believe, or it seems to people that there are stance independent facts about what's morally right or wrong? In that case, like it seems to people that realism is true. Realism explains that realism seems true. Maybe that makes sense. Like, if, hey, it seems like there's trees, the position there are trees makes sense of it seeming like there are trees. So that makes sense if that's what he's saying. So if that's the case, and it's a completely reasonable thing to say, like in abstract, like, hey, realism makes sense of our sense that realism is true, or something like that, or something that would entail realism is true. So, hey, seems like it's wrong to torture babies just for fun. What could make sense of that? Well, what could make sense of that is that it is wrong to torture babies just for fun. Again, stance independently. I don't know why that is dropped from these, because an anti-realist can make sense of the sense that it's wrong to torture babies by pointing out that it's wrong in some anti-realist consistent way. So, I don't know why when philosophers talk about this, they keep vacillating between dropping the metaethical qualifiers, like stance independently right or wrong. I think it'd be a lot clearer if they did indicate that, because when they don't consistently include it or not include it, I never know whether it's implicit in a particular use of a phrase or not. So is moral realism making sense of things seem right or wrong in a way that may or may not be stance independent, or does it specifically make sense of the data that it seems that things, or we think that things are stance independently right or wrong? I don't know, because Sampson, doesn't specify. It's not clear. So if you're not going to continue using stance independent as a qualifier, it might make sense to, like, we need language that says I'm just making a normative claim, or I'm making a normative claim and a metaethical claim. I don't know why metaethicists just move between normative metaethical, and don't make clear which one they're referencing. So I don't know what exactly he's saying here. But the issue just is, okay, so let's say the data. So the data is, it seems to us that some things are right or wrong, maybe stance independently, I don't know. And then realism makes sense of that. It vindicates or explains or accounts for that data. Okay, what is the data? So if I have data on what people believe, like I might do a survey and find, okay, well, it looks like 96% of people report having seen Bigfoot. How would I explain that data? Well, Bigfoot exists. Okay, well, what if less than 1% of people report seeing Bigfoot? How do I make sense of that data? Maybe the best explanation is that a few people living in remote regions have in fact seen Bigfoot. But another explanation is those people are wrong. They didn't really see Bigfoot. So we have a similar issue when it comes to the alleged data, that there's this thought that things are morally right or wrong, presumably in a sense that would be relevant to moral realism and wouldn't be equally consistent with anti-realism. Okay, what's the data here? So whose thought? Who thinks this? So Eric Sampson thinks this. Who else thinks this? Mike Humer thinks this. David Enoch thinks this. 26.6% of the respondents to the Phil paper survey in 2020, they think this, apparently. So about a quarter of them. Maybe some of the naturalist realists, they think this. So maybe it bumps all the way up near to 62%. Maybe some of the anti-realists. So maybe it bumps up to 70 or 80% of academic philosophers that responded to the Phil paper survey. What about non-philosophers? What about people in Russia? What about people in Ecuador? What about people in New York? I don't know. How would we know? Philosophers might think, most people probably think more or less the way I do. Why think that? Is there any particularly good reason to think that? If so, what are those reasons? So if you're gonna extrapolate from how you think to how other people think, okay, why? Where's the data that supports that the way you think generalizes to how everybody thinks? I mean, we can't make confident claims about how humans think or reason or act. Facts about human psychology are very difficult to establish. Even when we gather systematic data and thousands of people in the United States, it's difficult to figure out what people in the United States are like. And yet somehow philosophers think that by sitting in the armchair, they can figure out how everybody everywhere thinks in all 7,000 plus languages in the world. That, despite being almost exclusively from weird cultures, trained in weird cultures, weird as Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies like the United States, they're going to extrapolate from the way they think to the way everybody thinks without any empirical data at all. So we don't need psychology. You just think. This is why I say philosophy is often very bad psychology. It's often psychology with a sample size of 1. Looks to me like Eric Sampson is making psychological claims here, but is not engaged with the psychological data. So what's really strange about this is I get a lot of comments. How is the psychological data relevant to the case for realism or anti-realism? How is it relevant? How is it relevant? Well, when the philosophers themselves are making empirical claims about human psychology, they appear to be utilizing that data to inform their theories. So if they're wrong about the data, then to the extent that the data that they're appealing to is intended to support the theory, it doesn't, because they're wrong about it. So that's how it's relevant. They seem to me presumptively to take it to be relevant because they themselves are citing or appealing to it. So it's real strange when people say, how is this relevant? Why does the data matter? Analytic philosophers that rely predominantly on a priori methods or armchair methods will make sweeping claims about human psychology. And then if I challenge them by saying, that's not what the psychology says, suddenly the psychology is not relevant. What the hell? Pick one. It can't be the psychology is relevant as long as you're making armchair claims and nobody's questioning them. But the moment somebody questions them, somehow it's not relevant anymore. What the hell is that? Real weird.
It seems as clear to me as anything that plowing through passengers just to get to your parking spot a little faster is morally wrong.
Yeah, it seems to him. It seems to him that it's morally wrong normatively, because I disapprove of it. It is inconsistent with my values. So in those senses, I'm perfectly happy to say it also seems wrong to me. It's got nothing to do with realism. Realism doesn't explain my preference against plowing into people in your car or something. It doesn't explain my attitude of disapproval. What explains that are facts about my psychology. Moral realism doesn't explain that at all. It would be a terrible explanation if, in saying that doing whatever action he just described as morally wrong, if in saying that we mean things that can be cashed out in terms that are readily accountable for by anti-realist accounts, what do we need realism for? How does it explain that? I don't need stance-independent moral facts to explain why I disapprove of people doing that. So if it's intended to explain something, presumably it would be most efficacious if or not at all otherwise, unless it was accounting for people thinking that things are stance independently wrong. Now, Sampson may think this way, but what evidence do we have that most people pre-theoretically, that is prior to studying the various metaethical theories on the table, what evidence do we have that those people are systematically inclined towards having similar experiences, beliefs, or attitudes about what's morally right or wrong? Don't have much. We don't have a lot of data to support that. So if this is supposed to be data, who is the data about? It's data about Eric Sampson? Okay, who else? Because I bet you I can find more people that believe in horoscopes and astrology and seeing auras than I can people that really seem to show some inclination towards endorsing moral realism. I don't think we have strong evidence of that.
I really don't know what philosophical claim you could bring to me that's going to be more plausible than that. So you might say, oh, well, what about, isn't it the case that everything that has this property also has this property or something, some like abstract metaphysical property or metaphysical claim? I'll say, no. I mean, if what we're doing in philosophy is we're trying to begin with claims that are exceedingly plausible and we're trying to work out the implications.
Exceedingly plausible. How are we determining which views are plausible? So I think only anti-realist views are plausible. And I find realist views, especially non-naturalist realist views like Eric Sampson's, to be so outrageously implausible that I think the existence of Bigfoot is more plausible. I think the existence of God is more plausible. I think, take your pick. I mean, we could pick some really silly claims out there that there's a secret conspiracy of flamingos to take over the world. That might be more plausible. So like moral realism, I think, is that implausible. And People might hear that and go, well, you're showing a lack of intellectual humility. You're welcome to say that. I don't particularly care if you say that. What matters to me is the quality of the arguments, and I don't think realists are bringing good arguments to the table. So, if that makes me show a lack of intellectual humility, okay. I mean, you could judge me by that standard if you want to. I still want to see good arguments. And someone saying it seems to me, and this is the data, and not being specific about what the data is or how they determine what the data is, those don't strike me as good. Because I could say, look, the data is, it seems pretty obvious that there are no objective moral truths, that there are no stance-independent moral facts, that moral realism is clearly false. That's the data. So what would be a good explanation for that? Oh, well, it's that moral realism is not true. That would explain that. So that's the data. I could assert that. What makes Eric's claim to the contrary any more compelling than my claim? When I see realists constantly talk about how their view is pre-theoretically more plausible, it's more plausible in a more general sense, it's the more intuitive, it's the more obvious, obvious to them, intuitive to them, pre-theoretically appealing to them, perhaps. It's not to me, and it never has been, as far as I can tell. And so, what privileges how things seem to them over how they seem to me? Why should we appeal to their views as some sort of default position, and then I have to argue against that rather than vice versa? Now, I'm not saying my views should be a default or presumption necessarily. What I'm saying is I don't see any reason to think that there's any dialectical presumption in favor of realism. Why? I just don't think they've established a presumption in favor of realism to begin with.
Applications of those things. That's as plausible as I can think of. So I'm committed to the idea, there's things that are right and wrong, and now I want to know, okay, so maybe it's wrong to plow into passengers because not because it's a truth independent of my mind, but instead it's a mind dependent truth. Maybe it is. Let's think. What's
Yeah, now it seems like there's a difference between saying it's wrong and saying it's mind independently wrong.
Wrong to plow into passengers because not because it's a truth independent of my mind. And now I want to know, okay, so maybe it's wrong to plow into passengers because not because it's a truth independent of my mind, but instead it's a mind dependent truth. Maybe it is. Let's think. What's the mind that
so you said mind dependent there
would make it wrong for me to plow through passengers at a crosswalk?
Yeah, so this is already going to be real weird.
It's a truth independent of my mind, but instead it's a mind dependent truth. Maybe it is. Let's think. What's the mind that would make it wrong for me to plow through passengers at a crosswalk?
So why would we think that there's a mind that makes it wrong? Wrong in what sense? It seems like the way a lot of realists frame anti-realist views, like stance-dependent views, is that so on the realist view, there are these floating moral facts, what you have reason to do, what is stance independently right or wrong. And then if you have a stance dependent account, that your stances generate moral facts. And those moral facts are almost like the kinds of moral facts that the realist believes in. It's just that it's your stances that make the facts. And then those facts sort of reflect back on you and are binding on you. So if I desire to, steal from a store, this generates the fact that I ought to steal from the store. And so, whoa, that's really wild. There's a fact that I ought to steal from the store, and that was created by my desire. Now, this is a weird, reified, bizarro type of anti-realism. I mean, it is a type of anti-realism because the moral facts are stance dependent, but they're still metaphysically bizarre. I mean, this is why I don't accept these accounts that moral facts, can be cashed out in terms of hypothetical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives are just as conceptually, I suspect, unintelligible, and perhaps they have metaphysical issues. I don't really care that much about that. But this type of anti-realism that it looks like he's about to describe, these stance-dependent accounts, are just one step away from realism. They're just a weird realism, and a weird anti-realism. And again, the weirdness is not the reason why I would reject them. It's just these are not the only options available to anti-realists for stance-dependent accounts. We could call these something like non-reductive stance-dependent accounts. So the stances generate facts about what you have reason to do or what you ought to do that now exist or that apply to you or are binding or are authoritative, but are not reducible to the desires or the preferences or the values themselves. So in other words, you have stances and the stances give you reasons or fact. Oh, my hand went the other way. You have desires. The desire or the stance gives you the reason, gives you the moral fact. And so now you have two separate things. I have the desire to steal, and then the desire to steal creates the fact that I ought to steal. And so there's two different things going on here. There's both the desire and the fact that I ought to steal. So we'll see what he says about this, and then I'll give commentary on how a reductive account handles this and just doesn't succumb to the kinds of problems he's talking about.
Would it be wrong because God said so? I mean, there's a famous objection to that kind of view that the rightness and wrongness depends on God's commands, and it's the Euthyphro problem. And basically the idea is this: look, if God commands you not to plow into passengers at a crosswalk, it's either because he recognizes that it's wrong, that it's bad for you to do that, and that's why he's commanding it, in which case there are truths independent of God, or there's just no fact of the matter about whether it's wrong to plow into passengers, but God is just, commanding because that's just like, I don't know, for whatever reason, he felt like commanding you not to do that.
Yeah, so this isn't a good way of depicting the Euthyphro dilemma, because it's like, okay, so your options are, so God commands you to do something. It could be something terrible, plow into a group of people in the street or whatever, sacrifice your son on an altar. And he depicts it as like either that would be wrong, right or wrong, independent of God, in which case you're back to the square one. You still have to deal with your sort of non-theistically dependent realism. Or what's he said? Like God just felt like it or something.
In which case there are truths independent of God, or there's just no fact of the matter about whether it's wrong to plow into passengers, but God is just,
So for a divine command theorist, there would be a fact of the matter. The fact of the matter would depend on whether God commanded you to do it or to not do it. So it's not that there's no fact of the matter. It might be indeterminate whether it's right or wrong prior to God commanding it, but once God commands it, that settles whether there's a fact of the matter or not. So if that's all he's saying, that's fine. But then look what he goes on to say.
Commanding because that's just like, I don't know, for whatever reason he felt like commanding you not.
I don't know, for whatever reason he felt like it. See, it's depicting stance-dependent accounts as though what's prompting them is arbitrary or a whim or just decided, on the fly. And that does not at all have to be the case for stance-dependent accounts. Stance-dependent accounts could be something is right or wrong on the basis of whether it would accord with the standards of an agent that meets certain thick descriptive characteristics. So it's an agent that is, super compassionate, highly concerned with minimizing harm, any type of physical or psychological distress, so on and so forth. And then you could say, well, why is it commanding that a person abstain, say? Because, presumably the consistency of the commands would, they would only be consistent with these sort of thick descriptive characteristics. So you imagine this compassionate whatever being says, hey, I command you to not harm those people. Okay, well, is it deciding that on a whim or because it feels like it? No, it's deciding it because that's the kind of being it is. And so that it doesn't have to be arbitrary or whimsical when it's issuing a command. It could be issuing a command in accord with its nature. So I don't think that this is a fair representation of a view. I don't even endorse the view, but this seems like it's treating stance-dependent accounts, at least this form of a stance-dependent account, as if you endorse a stance-dependent account, then the moral standards that you would abide by are you're flippant about them, they're whimsies, you're not serious about it. And this is just not true. Take people's food preferences or take a person that's passionate about art. Well, what kind of art they're passionate about does depend on their preference. Let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, we're stance-dependent theorists about art preference. Does that mean that people just decide on I'm going to paint this today, I'm going to paint that today? Or think of a classical composer or a chef. Our chefs just, I just felt like making this. No, there are deep underlying principles about human psychology and human taste perception and other psychological factors, the way that food is presented, how it appears aesthetically, the sort of kinesthetics, the smells. There's all these facts about our psychology, and what they might be trying to do is optimize for giving someone a good experience. And even though everything about, good food and bad food, a good culinary experience and a bad culinary experience, all of those normative and evaluative aspects are cashed out in terms of considerations that are ultimately stance-dependent, not stance-independent. Even though they're all cashed out in terms of stance-dependent considerations, that in no way suggests that the chef is making whimsical decisions that aren't rooted in principles about or reasonable expectations about what would plausibly generate a good or bad food experience in their customers. So Yeah, this idea that stance-dependent means whimsical, this seems to me to be a common mischaracterization and a kind of caricature of stance-dependent accounts. Oh, Digital Gnosis showed up. Hey, Nathan says, Ayo. Hey, that's a link to my Substack in the chat. It is. Yeah, I really like that post. I thought it was great. Even though there's some minor points that I disagree with, I just love to see people smacking back at all this intuition stuff. Yeah, I mean, philosophers seem to have tried to bury the discussions from about a decade ago on intuitions and metaphilosophy, but I think that it's kind of like psychology's replication crisis. This is a very big problem in philosophy, and it has not been adequately addressed. And philosophical trends may have prompted many people to find it to be boring or interesting and to move on, but I don't think we should move on. Or maybe I just haven't been reading it for a while. But this stuff about intuitions, we need clarity on the matter. Because it's real frustrating that you simultaneously have people like Capellan saying nobody uses intuitions in philosophy at all, basically. And then you have other people saying everyone uses them all the time forever. And it's those positions, for those to exist within the same field, and we got to get some clarity on the matter. And I don't think we're there yet. All right.
Not to do that. If it's the first thing, if he's already recognizing that it's wrong and reporting it to you, then there's a fact independent of our minds. If he's just like saying it because he feels like it, then I guess I think then morality is just totally arbitrary, and there's just absolutely no reason to follow it at all. It's not the kind of thing I should pay attention to, and certainly God's commands are not the kind of things that I should pay attention to. And so but morality just doesn't seem to be, arbitrary in that way. So it
just doesn't seem to be. Doesn't seem to be. To who? Am I going to become an owl? To who? To who? It doesn't seem to be. Note how frequently Eric Sampson falls back on how things seem to be, what's intuitive, what the data allegedly is, what we think. Over and over and over, it's unclear. Is Eric Sampson reporting what he thinks, what his intuitions are, how things seem to him? Or is he making claims about what other people think, how things seem to other people, what other people find intuitive? And if he is making the former claim, who cares? It's one person making these claims. I don't particularly care. Again, if Eric Sampson's the only person that feels this way, I could find I could go to some National Bigfoot Society and find a lot more people that it seems to them that Bigfoot is real. And, that wouldn't be plausible. But if he's making claims about other people, show me the data. Show me this data. Where is this data showing that other people think this way? Ah, that's right. We don't have it. We don't really have data showing that. At least not any good data.
So it doesn't look like either story about, the rightness or wrongness of plowing into passengers has anything to do with God's commands. But that whole argument that I just gave right there, that's going to apply to basically any perspective that you give me. Like, what about, does rightness or wrongness depend on my commands or a society's commands or an ideal observer's commands? In all those cases, I'm going to ask the same thing as I asked about the God case, which is, well, hold on. Does the ideal observer, they disapprove of me plowing through passengers? Why? Why do they disapprove of it? Either the ideal observer disapproves of me plowing through passengers because he sees that it's wrong, and that's why he disapproves of it, in which case there's a truth independent of the ideal observer. Or it's just like he gets this twitch when I plow into passengers you
see, either there are stance independent facts, and so they can't be stance dependent, or it's a twitch, or it's a whim. Why would it be one? It's either stance independent or a twitch. So, when people have preferences about things, music, food, your preference for your family. So I have a preference for my family over other people's family. I care more about my family than other people's families. I just do. That's a psychological fact about me. If there's a burning building and I could save a member of my family or a random single other stranger, maybe if there's enough other people, maybe I wouldn't sacrifice, maybe I would allow one family member to die to save millions of other people, maybe thousands, maybe hundreds. I don't know where the cutoff point would be, but all else being equal, I favor my own family members over non-family members. Now, I don't think my preference for my family members is rooted in some stance-independent moral fact about what I should or shouldn't do. It's entirely a matter of my personal psychology, my personal preferences and values. Subjective, stance-dependent values Now, I'm not advocating stance-dependent account of morality. I'm simply telling you about my personal psychology. I'm not making a claim about ordinary moral semantics. I'm not making a claim about semantics at all. I'm not making a claim about metaphysics at all. I'm simply telling you, I personally care more about my family than random strangers, all else being equal. Now, given that fact, suppose I'm in a situation where I have to act in my family's interest over random strangers in equal proportions, and I act in favor of my family. Would it be reasonable? Would it be fair to describe that as just some twitch, just a whim? No, these are deeply held values. And so often when people are contrasting stance-independent theories with stance-dependent theories, they depict stance-dependent theories as some feeble whimsy, just a whatever. It's totally arbitrary. Ask yourself, look, philosophers love their intuition pumps. Ask yourself, is your preference, is the love you have for your family or your closest friends, does that feel arbitrary to you? Does that feel like just mere, like you're just like what clothes you're going to wear in the morning? Is it just another decision you have to make? Just a whatever, no big deal. Merely because it's, and I say mere with scare quotes, merely stance dependent doesn't really matter, does it? It doesn't really matter because it's stance dependent. So your family doesn't really matter than other people's families. Your preference for your family is just arbitrary. Doesn't feel that way to me. And I'm not compelled by that. Why would you depict the stance dependent accounts as though the psychology of them is as soft, as pliable, as weak as he is here, when that's just psychologically, I mean, look, philosophers love, again, Eric does this, philosophers love to talk about how things seem, what our experience is like. That is not at all how I experience my preferences. Sure, some of my preferences are a bit of a whim. So if I'm at a restaurant and there's, I don't know, 2 different salads, do I want the Caesar salad or the cucumber tomato salad? I might go, yeah, I feel like the Caesar salad today. That's the kind of decision I might make on a whim. No big deal, just a preference. That doesn't mean my preference for my family is as equally as whimsical as that, is equally unimportant to me. The degree to which stance-dependent values are important to us, are essential to our identity, our lives, can vary dramatically from being the most important things we could conceive of to some of the least important things, or we don't care at all, or barely care at all. Why depict them in so unflattering a light? Well, I think it sharpens the contrast between realism and anti-realist views in a way that makes the anti-realist views look unpalatable, undesirable, stupid, silly, counterintuitive, philosophically lacking in rigor, something almost gross about, it's like you're comparing the value of human life to your ice cream preferences. It's gross. This is a caricature of the psychology of stance-dependent accounts. And what I don't understand is why professional philosophers caricature. Why do this? Why? Why? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear in the chat or the comments. Why did they do this?
At a crosswalk, he just all of a sudden just disapproves. But then I'd
see, look how bad it is. All of a sudden just disapproves. So look, I'm a moral anti-realist. I don't think anything is stance independently right or wrong. Do I just all of a sudden disapprove of torturing babies? No, it's a deeply held value I have that torturing people is wrong. I don't just all of a sudden decide this. And also, do we even decide what our moral standards are? I don't decide my food. I don't really like chocolate ice cream very much. I actually much prefer vanilla. That's not a joke. I'm serious about that. I love peanut butter, so I love peanut butter ice cream. I like pistachio ice cream. I don't choose it's not like I wake up in the morning and I'm like, I'd rather like chocolate ice cream, so I do. I don't choose my preferences. In fact, preferences may be just as stable, if not more stable than beliefs. I don't really choose what foods I like. I don't choose what music I like, but there may be some degree of control over the kinds of information I consume and what beliefs I end up having. What beliefs I end up having. I don't know. That's an empirical question. The degree to which beliefs are subject to voluntary control versus preferences being subject to voluntary control. You could also shape your preferences. I'm not saying you can't, but the malleability of preferences and beliefs, like the relative malleability, is an open empirical question. And so it's kind of strange that realists will depict stance-dependent accounts of morality and other sorts of axiological perspectives as being this like hyper pliable, like you just decide, it's just a whim. It's not. And if they think it is, demonstrate that, like show that that's the case, because they typically don't. It's just depicted this way without any arguments or evidence to support these sorts of characterizations.
I'd want to know, wait, why would that ground rightness and wrong? Why would that make it wrong? This is like the ideal observer is like, hey, I don't approve of that kind of stuff. Why would that make it wrong? Like, why isn't it just like he doesn't like it? Doesn't seem like it has any relation to rightness and wrong.
This is real weird. That the idea that an ideal observer, it doesn't have any relation to right or wrong. Okay, so an ideal observer. So you might think, I don't know if I'm going to steal man ideal observer theory here or not, but okay, I don't know what the right or wrong thing like this is just a hypothetical. I don't know what the right or wrong thing to do is. What would I do in this situation? Well, I suspect, as a matter of psychological fact, that people, generally speaking, rational agents, have similar goals and preferences. And if we had access to all of the relevant non-moral facts, we knew all the data about what the world is like, all the empirical considerations, all the logical considerations, all the facts. If we were in possession of that data, we would be in a better position to make a decision about what we would do, like what I would do. Well, I know I have biases, and they might skew my judgments in ways that, like, maybe I favor my own family over strangers. And maybe I think, on reflection, that's not what I should be doing. So what would an ideally rational agent do that isn't me, that is some other agent that occupies a vantage point that isn't biased towards my view or another view, is in possession of all of the relevant facts, and isn't biased toward, it's unbiased and fully informed, and is like super duper rational and super well informed? What would they do? Well, that's the thing. If I were really thinking about this, I think I should do. And so if I could put myself in a position to think about what that being would do, or if there's some way, like let's say this being actually existed and it could generate output, like it could deliver what to do in a fortune cookie or something like that, that somehow I would, I'd go, here's the instructions. Maybe I would follow them. If you're in favor of some sort of ideal observer theory, what the lack of, why is he depicting this like there's no connection? The connection is that such a being may reflect, your own epistemic and normative ideals about what decisions you think you want to live by, or that you consider binding on you. So a person could think that. I don't see anything particularly silly about that.
Wrongness. Seems like his reactions are totally arbitrary. Like seems like he just as easily could have disapproved of it. If there's just no reason, he approves or disapproves of it. It's just the brute reactions that he.
Yeah. Why would these be brute reactions? Why would there be no reasons? This seems like a caricature of the view.
Has. They're totally arbitrary. So in other words, that was all a big long way of saying, like, you're asking, like, why should you be a realist? What does it solve? Well, I just think it makes sense of this idea, both that there is such a thing as rightness and wrongness, and it seems to make sense of what makes it right or wrong to do something. I think I know why it's wrong to plow into passengers at a crosswalk. It's because it causes enormous suffering for a trivial benefit. But the fact that something causes enormous suffering for a trivial benefit doesn't depend on anyone's attitudes. That's a truth independent of everyone's minds. But if the thing that makes it wrong is independent of everyone's mind, then that means that there are moral truths independent of people's mind, and that's why you should attitudes. That's a truth independent of everyone's minds. Enormous suffering for a trivial benefit. But the fact that something causes enormous suffering for a trivial benefit doesn't depend on anyone's attitudes. That's a truth independent of everyone's minds.
When did he establish that?
But if the thing that makes it wrong is independent of everyone's mind, then that means that there are moral truths independent of people's mind, and that's why you should. And that's a very brief story about why I think you should be a realist. If you just reflect on why the things that are wrong, and you try to run through like.
Okay, so if you just reflect on why the things you think are wrong, is that what he said?
That's why you should. Right. And that's a very brief story about why I think you should be a realist. If you just reflect on why the things that are wrong.
If you just reflect on why the things that are wrong,
and you try to run through like what mind could make things right or wrong.
And you run through what mind could make things right or wrong.
None of the candidates seem plausible, so that seems
None of the candidates seem plausible. Okay, so I have reflected on this, and I have concluded that facts about what are right or wrong, to the extent that I could reasonably talk about them, reflect my values. They do depend on me. So I did reflect on this, and that is what I concluded. So I did reflect, and I reached the conclusion that he just said you wouldn't reach. So what's going on there? Did I reflect incorrectly? Okay, what mistake did I make? What mistake did I make? I'd love to know. Is the mistake that I didn't conclude what he did? Why is his conclusion correct and mine is incorrect? So there seems to be the presumption here that if you reflect on the matter, you will come to this conclusion. This kind of position reminds me a lot of like when Christians say, well, if you pray and no one answers your prayer, then, you can't be what's the term? Nathan, if you're in the chat, you'll know the term. Like a non-resistant non-believer, something like that. I've been told, well, if you keep praying and God doesn't speak to you, you don't hear from God, or you don't get a sign, or you don't feel the power of the Lord or whatever, you weren't really sincere all along. So the same idea could be applied here where, in other words, hey, if you pray correctly, you'll find God. So if you don't find God, you must not have prayed correctly. So you could do that kind of reverse inference here, which is if you've reflected and you haven't discovered that realism is true, then you haven't reflected correctly. So nobody reflects correctly and then concludes that realism is not true. No one reflects correctly and arrives at a different conclusion as Eric Sampson. That might be lurking behind this, and I just don't buy it. I have reflected, and I reflected that this is a ridiculous position. It's one of the most obviously not true positions I could possibly imagine. That's the result of my reflection. And that's only been enforced by further reflecting. So Eric is welcome to say, I'm in the grip of a theory. Again, though, demonstrate that. Demonstrate I'm in the grip of a theory and that you're not in the grip of a theory and that this is somehow a problem. Eric is making assertions here, but I'm not seeing a lot of support for those assertions.
that seems to suggest that there's rightness and wrongness, but it's independent of anyone's mind.
Yes, even if it was a divine command which made it right, the divine command, it originated in God's mind, so it's not really mind independent. And if there were no actual facts about morality outside of God's mind that God was appealing to, then it could be just God's aesthetics, and whatever God feels is right, or what ends up being for us moral commands, right?
Yeah.
And the truth of right and wrong. So its lineage goes.
It doesn't have to be aesthetics. It could be like a game theoretic considerations, or consistency with certain values or principles. It doesn't have to be something as objectionably vacuous.
Goes all the way back into a mind of a God that has aesthetical sort of preferences.
Yeah. So basically, what I want to point out for non-real, I'm sure there's tons of non-realist or anti-realists out there. I just want to say, look, if you think that the Euthyphro dilemma is a good objection to divine command theory, and everyone that I know of who's an anti-realist does, they're not a divine command theorist, and they're not a divine command theorist because of the Euthyphro dilemma. I just want to say, why doesn't that same argument just apply to whatever you think is the perspective that makes things right or wrong?
So I don't think it's a good argument, but why doesn't it apply to my perspective? Okay.
If you think it's the
reductive perspectives, this isn't a problem for them. So on a reductive perspective of moral language, to say that murder is wrong, or torture, plowing a group of people or torturing babies is wrong, amounts to saying something like, I disapprove of murder or torturing babies or something like that. So if that's the case, well, the fact that I do disapprove of it does make it true that the sentence, I disapprove of it, true. It's pretty easy. So what's the problem there? And how is that subject to the Euthyphro dilemma? So there's a pretty straightforward mapping of the truth of the sentence. So again, translate. Murder is wrong. We'll just pick an easy one instead of these long, like baby torturing for fun. Murder is wrong. Okay, so murder is wrong. The sentence, murder is wrong. If we say, okay, just by stipulation, for the purposes of what I mean when I say things, I'm not making a semantic claim about the meaning of moral sentences. I'm just saying when I say murder is wrong, what I mean by murder is wrong is I disapprove of murder. Okay. Now, and this is like a very simplified version. I think my views on this are more complicated than that, but we're oversimplifying for the purposes of exposition. Okay. Murder is wrong just means I disapprove of murder. Now we have the statement, I disapprove of murder. Because they mean the same thing, we could shift over to looking at the statement, I disapprove of murder. Now, do stance-dependent accounts make sense of whether the statement, I disapprove of murder is true or false? Well, according to these accounts, whether the statement, I disapprove of murder is true or false is made true by my stance on whether murder is right or wrong. And so if I disapprove of murder, it makes the sentence, I disapprove of murder true. And if I don't disapprove of murder, then it makes the sentence, I disapprove of murder, again, when I say it, false, because I'd be lying or something. Now, we have the fact, I do disapprove of murder, and then we have the sentence that I'm saying, because it's an index to me, because I'm using the term I. So I say, like I'll say it right now, I disapprove of murder. Now, I do disapprove of murder. So the fact that I disapprove of murder makes the sentence, I disapprove of murder, when I say it, true. No Euthyphro dilemma. There's no problem here. So reductive accounts to these reductive stance-dependent accounts cash out what's right or wrong in terms of the preferences, the desires, the attitudes of approval or disapproval, or the stances. There's no further fact that you would then say, but okay, how is it that, so because you could take the horns of the is it wrong because you think it is, or would it be wrong independent of whether you think it is? Yeah, it's wrong because you think it is, because it being wrong just is to say what you think it is. Like they're the same thing. They end up becoming, I guess you could say, like analytically equivalent. So what's the issue here? I think there is no issue. So I don't think this is a problem for people that hold these sorts of views. It would be a problem for like the weirdo stance-dependent accounts that are somewhere between realism and anti-realism. Yeah, Jimothy says, LOL, as if the Euthyphro is the only reason to not be a divine command theorist. To be fair, I'm not sure he said it was the only reason. Maybe he did. I don't know.
It's the right or wrong depends on your culture. Like, why would, if you think that the Euthyphro dilemma is a good objection to divine command theory, and most everyone that I know of who's an anti-realist does, they're not a...
Yeah, he's not saying it's the only objection. It's just that they might think that's one good reason among many to not be a divine command theorist.
Divine command theorists, and they're not...
But of course, like an atheist isn't going to be... They're not going to be a divine command theorist for a pretty obvious reason. They don't think God exists.
Divine command theorist because of the Euthyphro dilemma. I just want to say, like, why doesn't that same argument just apply to whatever you think is the perspective that makes things right or wrong? Like, if you think it's the right or wrong depends on your culture, like, why wouldn't the Euthyphro dilemma work against that? Or if you think it's an ideal observer, you think it's your ideal self or something, like, why doesn't the Euthyphro objection work just the same in all those cases? Yeah, that's what I want to say.
Cool. So
what, like, is Eric not aware of more reductive accounts? Because he's saying, why doesn't it work in all these cases? Well, maybe it does work against various types of stance-dependent accounts. But what about the ones that I just described where this wouldn't apply to them? How would it address those? I'd be curious to know what he would say. He might say, nobody really defends those, or, oh, those have other problems, or, oh, those aren't really the standard forms. And maybe that's not all he would say, but there's moves he could probably make. I don't know what those moves are. So hopefully at some point we could have a discussion, because I'd like to know what he would think about, for instance, my own view, because it's not wrapped up in this Euthyphro stuff.
So, yeah, look, punching innocent children or torturing babies is usually considered bad by most people, unless maybe you're a Ted Bundy or something like that. But what's the difference from it being bad, inherently bad, and it just being instrumentally bad for some other goal or value? Like, yeah.
Yeah, so if it's merely
like,
instrumentally
you didn't want to
bad,
get thrown in jail or something, or you just thought it would be a nice world to live in, like if babies weren't tortured and innocent children weren't punched.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess it's true that torturing innocent children is instrumentally bad. Like, if you want to stay out of jail, you shouldn't be doing that. That's true. But that's not all. Like, what if I don't care about jail? What about that? Then I guess I think, yeah, you still shouldn't do it. And if you ask me, yeah, but why? I'd say, oh, well, that's easy. It's just because the baby experiences like enormous suffering, and then suffering is morally important. How do you know that? Well, if you just reflect on the nature of suffering, if you've ever suffered before, and you just think about what it's like to suffer, then you'll just see that once you understand what suffering is like, you'll see immediately that.
Once you reflect on what suffering is like, you'll just see immediately that
it's the kind of thing that you ought to avoid.
it's the kind of thing that you ought to avoid. Okay, I reflected on it, and I have not come to that conclusion. In fact, I think that sounds nonsensical. I don't think that in reflecting on suffering that you can discover or come to recognize that it's this kind of thing that you ought to avoid. I don't believe in irreducible normativity. Nothing about my experience of suffering. Like when I suffer, it's the kind of thing I want to avoid. I discover that. I discover things about my attitudes or preferences, that certain sorts of experiential states, I don't like having them and I don't want them. But what I don't discover or find on reflection is that I ought to avoid them, or that they are intrinsically bad, or that I ought to avoid them independent of whether I didn't want to have them or something like that. The only reasonable way in which I would say I ought not have these experiences is just another way of saying I don't want to have them. I disapprove of them. I would like to avoid them. I will try to avoid them. I can cash it out entirely in terms of my desires, my goals, my attitudes, my preferences, my values, and not at all, like nothing is gained by saying that I ought to independent of those goals or values or preferences. Nothing is added by that. That is completely irrelevant to my motivations, to my goals, to my desires. It's not at all a part of what happens when I reflect on the nature of suffering. In fact, not only when I reflect on suffering does what he's describing here not appear the case, it appears to me to be the case that I've reflected sufficiently to know that that's not the case. So, if you reflect a whole lot on something, you can come to some conclusions about what's not the case. So if I think a whole lot about squares, I can come to the conclusion that they are not seven-sided because they're squares. And so I've reflected on my suffering. So maybe you want to take this to be some qualitative or experiential state. Okay, so I could reflect on the taste of a certain kind of food or a certain kind of smell or a certain kind of emotion. Okay, well, nothing about my emotions of anger or sense of vengeance makes me think that I ought to get vengeance, independent of whether or not it would serve my interests, or that I should feel angry, whether or not it would be consistent with my desires to do so. Nothing about those experiences indicates to me that those things are the case. And in fact, when I reflect on them, I kind of feel like all there is to them is a certain attitude or feeling or sentiment that is generated by my evolved human mind, and that there isn't anything more to them. Like I thought about them. Those are the properties they have. They don't have other properties. Nothing further to say here. And so when I think about my own pain experiences, my own suffering experiences, they're things I want to avoid. And that's it. There's nothing further. And so not only has my reflection not yielded the conclusion that Eric Sampson is suggesting that one would arrive at were they to reflect on this, I've actually arrived at the opposite conclusion, that his position on this is mistaken. And to me, it's not like this was a difficult thing for me to arrive at. This strikes me as like, look, I don't like to appeal to how obvious things are. I don't care about intuitions. But if anything, like this seems, what he's describing here seems obviously wrong to me. Like it's not just that it doesn't seem right. It's that it seems obviously wrong. Again, though, I don't care about intuitions. I don't think I have some special truth tracking faculty when I reflect on these things. I reflect on suffering, something I'd rather avoid. That's all there is to it. There's nothing further. There's no deep metaphysical facts. There's no special irreducibly normative considerations. It doesn't seem to me like there are. Nothing about my reflections on the matter indicate that there are. Now, Eric might say, well, then you haven't reflected good enough. Okay, well, maybe he hasn't reflected good enough. Again, why privilege his reflections over mine? Why? Does he have, do we have any reason to think he's better at reflecting on suffering than I am? If so, what are those reasons? Let's go back and look at this again. I see Sapir in the chats here. Yeah, Timothy says, just reflect more. Sapir says, just simply reflect on the nature of suffering and you immediately see that it is what you ought to avoid. Yeah, I don't, again, with the metaphors too, with the seeing, I don't immediately see that. In fact, if I were going to use a metaphorical sense of seeing, I see that that's not the case. So apparently Eric Sampson is wrong because I see that he's wrong. Now, would anybody in philosophy take that seriously? No, because they privilege reports like Eric Sampson's, and they I guess you could say disprivilege reports like mine. Somehow his reports are veridical and reports like mine are silly aberrations. Why? Who knows? If people with my perspective, if we were 62% of philosophers, maybe we would be acting like anybody that doesn't share how things seem to us, and what's obvious to us is just a silly goose. Sapir says, when I reflect on the law of non-contradiction, I immediately see that it's true. Sapir again, you have incorrectly reflected on the true metaphysical nature of suffering. Yeah, just why should I buy into a methodological account that's where someone says, yeah, when you reflect on things, you'll see that I'm right. You'll see that I'm right. Like imagine I went on here saying, yeah, if you reflect on the matter, you'll just see I'm right about the unintelligibility of moral claims. You'll just see that I'm right about pragmatism. You'll just see it. Just no one would take that seriously. So let's go back a little bit because I want to rehash what you're saying here.
It's easy. It's just because the baby experiences like enormous suffering, and then suffering is morally important. How do you know that? Well, if you just reflect on the nature of suffering, if you've ever suffered before, and you just think about what it's like to suffer, then you'll just see that once you understand what suffering is like, you'll see immediately that it's the kind of thing that you ought to avoid. And that's what that kid is experiencing. And
so this doesn't happen to me. And you know what? He's like, if you've ever experienced suffering. So I have extremely severe tinnitus. I have constant ringing in my ears. It's extremely loud. I can't even mask it with that. So I have a white noise right now that I'm playing while I'm in this video. It often causes some problems when I'm trying to play videos, like it'll get multiple audio streams and stuff like that. When I say extremely severe, I mean it's so loud it's not possible to mask it without harming my hearing. And it's a sharp, piercing sound. It's horrible. I also am quite frequently in pain. I get headaches all the time. My face hurts all the time. So I suffer quite a bit on a daily basis. I can say at this point, I don't think I have any clear memory of what it's like to not be in a perpetual state of discomfort and frequent pain. Like I don't even have a memory of what that's like. So I've sometimes had people say, well, maybe you haven't reflected on suffering well enough. And my answer to people that say that is this. It's rather frustrating when people will try to tell you what your experiences are like or make assumptions about who you are and what you go through. I try not to do that with others, and I hope that they will stop doing that with me. It's more than a little frustrating to continue to see comments in the online debate spaces of people accusing other people of dishonesty without adequate evidence, of people calling people liars, of people saying, you think this way or you've experienced that. It's real annoying. It's the lowest form of criticism to make sweeping assumptions about other people's experiences or lives or psychologies without having any direct knowledge of what their experiences are like. This isn't a response to Eric. This is a response to other people. So apologies, Eric, for getting upset about other people. What you've said here just reminded me of unpleasant experiences that I've had with online discussions, not with you. I think our discussion was perfectly cordial. But yeah, it reminded me of when people will say, what do you know about suffering? Or what do you know about this or whatever? People shouldn't do that. Well, this is, if Eric and I, I'd love to have another discussion with him because we had one quite a while ago when I was pretty new to YouTube. I hope Eric and I can agree on our disagreement with Sam Harris. In fact, you know what? I would love to review a Sam Harris video with a moral realist, especially a non-naturalist realist. So if there's in fact, I'll just say this now. If there's a non-naturalist realist out there that would like to review Sam Harris's content on morality, I'd love to have you on the channel to talk about it with me. I feel like we could find a lot of camaraderie and common ground. And, it's a funny thing because I do emphasize a lot my criticisms of moral realists, but often my criticisms of moral realists are like, that's my target. But there's lots of spaces and places and ways in which I may very well agree with moral realists on certain considerations in contrast to other sorts of positions. So, when realists are railing against this kind of wishy-washy, let every culture do whatever they want type of tolerance relativism, I'm not a fan of that. If there's a horrific human rights violation going on across the border and someone goes, well, to each their own, I don't have that attitude at all. I'm not keen on immediately reflexively intervening in every situation, no matter what, because you could do more harm than good. But I certainly don't think you should be indifferent or ambivalent about human suffering just because it happens on the other side of an invisible barrier. And I'm not going to get into too much detail about that, but I think a lot of the animus that realists have towards anti-realists is motivated by a sort of a folk relativist view that often seems to me to foster moral complacency and a lack of concern about the welfare of others. And I think that's repugnant. And I agree with him about that being bad. So I keep putting the hand in the wrong place. If realists want to get on the same page about that, I'm happy to do so. And, part of the reason I'm saying this is because I think Sam Harris encountered just a lot of people saying, who cares if people over there do this horrific thing? It's part of their culture. Well, I care. And I don't want people to do horrific things like mutilate people or whatever, torture people, because it's part of their culture. No. So when realists want to go after anti-realists that have views like that, cool. Digital Gnosis says, what's the Duns Scotus quote about burning people until they accept the law of non-contradiction? I don't know, but can you find it and post it here? Because then I can post it on here. Like I could show it on the screen. Timothy says, philosophers are built different. Don't know what that means. So, okay, people are being silly in the comments. Nathan, we have to admit Sam Harris is always right about the things he says. We have to admit. War Panther says, oh, dude, I'm sorry for... Yeah. Oh, I wasn't saying all that to... I was saying that to make an argumentative point. I'm not seeking sympathy. But sure, appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, this is a good point that Nero raises. Also, why did they, I assume you mean non-naturalist realists, also, why did they assume that moral naturalists are having remotely the same of seeming that they are? Many of them are imagining something purely descriptive. Right. That's something that came up in my discussion with Mike Humer. For whatever reason, people interpreted that as me saying that moral naturalists are not moral realists. That's ridiculous. Of course, moral naturalists are moral realists. The position is they're stance-independent moral facts. So I'm very straightforward about that. If you think they're stance-independent moral facts, I think of you as a moral realist. That's how I use the terminology anyway. So naturalists do, so they're moral realists. Simple as that. Now, my point there was that I'm not convinced at all. I mean, there's a couple of points. So one is that naturalism is so radically different in terms of what it's proposing that the moral facts are relative to non-naturalist realism, that lumping the two together and saying, hey, this presents a united realist front against the anti-realist, I think is a bit misleading. Because if the naturalist thinks the moral facts are descriptive and they don't have any normative force and they're not authoritative and they're not binding on us and so on and so forth, those kinds of facts are completely prosaic in a way that doesn't give you the non-naturalist realists any of the stuff that I think that they wanted out of non-naturalism in the first place. It just completely guts realism from a practical, authoritative perspective. Those kinds of facts, they're so unthreatening, I literally don't even tend to say naturalist views are false. I just say, well, if they're true, they're trivial. If they're kinds of facts that, moral facts are facts about what increases or decreases cooperation or promotes cooperation within a society. Okay. Yeah, there's facts about what promotes cooperation. And now what? Oh, nothing? Or well, I'll go about my business. They have no practical consequences. Because whatever those facts are were facts independent of whether they were moral facts anyway. So, or would be if like we imagine a world where the moral facts don't exist. Everything's the same. They just don't matter. So the other issue is I'm not sure at all that the phenomenology of the naturalist realist is like the phenomenology of the non-naturalist realist. The non-naturalist realist is relying on these ethical intuitions that things seem wrong in a certain sense. But the naturalist might say, hey, look, whether things seem wrong to me or not, moral facts are facts of this particular kind. There are facts about what promotes cooperation. This is something we discover using, like, let's say there's some sort of synthetic naturalist. That doesn't require any particular phenomenology. Same thing with analytic naturalism. Maybe they have some kind of phenomenology about sentences and like, well, the sentence murder is wrong seems to me like it's saying murder decreases well-being or murder fails to maximize utility. Seems to me that, but okay, so is it a linguistic intuition? I'm not sure that that's the kind of intuition that ethical intuitionists are having. I don't think they're just semantic intuitions. So, like, do they have the same, and also, these people have been at this for decades. Have they not figured this out and talked to one another? How do we not know the answer to this? Maybe someone does know the answer and I'm just not informed. I'm not sitting in a philosophy department talking to non-naturalists and naturalist realists, but I don't know if they have the same phenomenology. I suspect many of them don't. Burnt Cookie says, did you claim that moral realism results in worse ethical outcomes? No, I don't think so. I take that to be an empirical question. I don't know if it results in worse ethical outcomes. I think in one discussion, people asked about abolitionism, and I said that using like moral discourse might have worse outcomes than abandoning moral discourse, but that's not the same thing as being a realist, or whether like belief in realism would have worse outcomes. But here you asked specifically, did you claim that moral realism results in worse ethical outcomes? Well, I don't think realism is going to result in anything better or worse. Maybe belief in realism could have better or worse outcomes, but not realism itself directly. At least I don't think so. Okay.
And it's true that, it's fun to do that. If you're having fun torturing it, that's a nice thing too. But again, the benefit is going to be trivial compared to the torturing. I mean, there are going to be other reasons, because I don't want to say like, oh, well, if the torturer just enjoys torturing enough, like that's going to outweigh the disvalue of the pain the baby experiences. I want to say there's other reasons too why it's wrong to torture babies. But I mean, we could just start in the ordinary case, like the pleasure that the torturer derives is trivial compared to the suffering that the baby experiences. But there's also like reasons of like disrespect and treating an end and something who's an end in himself, like as a mere tool. There are many reasons why an action can be wrong. There doesn't have to be just one explanation.
One of the people who was highly influential on me turning to more of a philosophical view on morality was David Pearce, who was the founder of the World Transhumanist Association. You may know of him. He wrote The Hedonistic Imperative. He's a quite a hardline negative utilitarian, which I'm not as negative utilitarian slanted as he is. But one of the things that he says is that suffering and bliss, or the pleasure-pain spectrum, discloses the nature of the physical. And I think what he's really saying is morality is built into the natural world, in that it's disclosed through feelings. It's disclosed through sensations of pain or feelings of bliss. But what are your thoughts?
I don't disagree. So I certainly agree that pain is bad and pleasure is good. I guess I disagree with David Pearce just in this respect. I think there are other things that are also good and bad. And I think those are disclosed through reason. So I think he thinks they're disclosed through like the experience of having these, once you have the experience of pleasure and pain, you're like the goodness or badness is exposed to you under those conditions or something like that. And I'd say, so that's one way to, come to know value. Here's another way, by intuition. That is by considering, a life where, someone is, living happy enough life, but they don't really do anything with their life. All they do is they sit around on the couch all day and they just, they eat chips and they just watch TV all day. Now it's ecstatically fun for them, but they are, massively unhealthy and they don't achieve anything in their life and they're very stupid and, all these stuff, but they're just enjoying bliss and like virtually no pain. Is that a good life? And what I want to say is, if you reflect on this person, we're stipulating that they're pretty happy. Like every day they wake up and they're just ready to watch more like stupid TV and eat chips. So they're very happy.
Idiocracy style.
Yeah. But is there anything like, so if all that mattered was pleasures and pain, we should be super happy with this outcome. We should be like, this is great. This is like,
we should be happy with a warehouse of rabbits on dopamine drips.
That's right.
Drips, right?
This is among the best things that could happen. This guy right here, he's living among the best life for a human being. But I just want to submit to you that like, when you reflect on this guy's life, I hope you see there's something missing about something of value that's missing from his life. And it's not just pleasure, because we've built in that he's like ecstatically happy. Instead, it's that he's a piece of garbage. That is, he has no virtues. He has no excellences. He's not cool. He's not a badass. He has no competencies. He has no style. He has no achievements to speak of. So he's a loser. He's happy, but he's a loser. And what I want to say is, so what we're getting a grip on here is that there are things that matter besides pleasure and pain that make your life go well. And one of those is achievement, or cultivating virtues, or being a competent person, being the kind of person who can face the world, handle its difficulties with flair. I mean, that's awesome. And so what I want to say is one of the things it's valuable for its own sake is virtue. That is being just and wise and competent and generous and courageous. Like that, like if you just imagine a life of a person who is just in complete control of their mind and their reactions and their impulses. So like, when they sit down to do their work, they can do it because they see that what their work is important, and they're not, they don't have impulses to grab their phone and do all sorts. That life is awesome. That guy is a badass. And he's living a great life. And it's not because of the pleasure that's in his life. We could stipulate that he's living like a life that's not as pleasurable as the other guy. But which one do I want to be and which one's living a better life? It's not even close. I want to be the badass. What is all that supposed to say? It's what I'm trying to show is like, by reason, we can see that there are things that are valuable besides pleasure. And you can do it if you just consider these two lives. You can just see like, yes, that is a better way to be. So that means that there's stuff that matters that's not pleasure.
Things like information sensitivity to novelty, and the curiosity. Such you're not the sort of person who gets stuck.
Don't have much to say about that. Yeah, I mean, the kind of life he describes is his own kind of life I would want to live. But I don't think there's any stance-independent fact of the matter about whether any particular life is better than any other.
Stuck in a local maximum and or minimum, and want to always like make some trade-off between exploitation and exploration. I mean, I'm always trying to find principles behind everything that can be applied at scale, and not just be applied to an individual in their own life. I mean, I like virtue ethics, and I sort of see there's a lot of utility to it. Hint, hint. But how do we scale virtue ethics to be, I guess, useful in large populations over time? Like, for instance, it seems hard to compute.
Yeah. So, I mean, virtue ethics as a normative theory, like as a theory of like right and wrong. So some virtue theorists want to say, listen, I'm giving you a theory of right and wrong. The rightness is just what the virtuous person would do, and wrongness is what the virtuous person would never do. I don't want to say that. Look, all I want to be committed to is just this, that it's good to be virtuous. And you can see that if you just consider this life. So when you ask me like, oh, well, how could virtue ethics scale on the, at the broad level? I don't know if it can. I don't know. But I mean, yeah, so I'm not a committed virtue ethicist, other than just to say that I think it's good to be a virtuous person. But I guess I think like, if you're wondering like, how could we do this at scale? I mean, I guess I think in the old days, like when there, religious institutions were more pervasive and had a wider range. I mean, they at least had the tools. I don't know how successful they were, but they at least had the tools for cultivating virtue in people. So for instance, I'm not Catholic, but the Catholic Church, like one thing they try to do is they have lots of saints, and they describe to parishioners, like, here's this life that this person led. Let me tell you the details of their life. Let me tell you how awesome they were and how many sacrifices they made and how, courageous they were and all that kind of stuff. And what they're doing there is they're trying to show people a way to be excellent and a way to be virtuous. And then they're trying to give them some tools, like, here, if you pray and confess and you talk with these people, like that will help cultivate virtues in you. So that was all to say, like, your question was, how do you, implement virtue ethics large scale? I mean, we have a precedent for it, which is in religious institutions. And I'm not saying they have to be religious institutions. They could be secular ones. But I actually do lament this fact about modern institutions. There's virtually no talk of virtues, of how to cultivate courage and wisdom and temperance, like, being in control of your impulses. And I think that's definitely regrettable that we don't, provide that sort of language and those concepts to students, and try to, paint them a picture of a life, not just of pleasure, of, just getting as many good feelings as you can, but actually like trying to achieve something in your life and trying to.
I don't know what you think. Should I skip ahead on this? Because it's not metaethics, and I don't have much to say about it. Hero and villain narratives, special pleading to reject. Yeah, so let's skip ahead to this section here.
Another question I had is, philosophers appeal to common sense, obviousness, plausibility, reason, to explain. All these things are useful for explaining the physical world. Is it special pleading to only reject it when it comes to moral features in the world?
So is this a challenge to people who deny that there are moral features?
Yes.
Yeah. I do think that is a good challenge. So yeah, I mean, I guess I think, what we all try to do when we're doing philosophy or we're doing science or anything is we begin with lots of claims that strike us as clearly true upon consideration. And they may strike us as clearly true for many reasons, maybe intuition, maybe perception, maybe reason, like reasoning about things make them strike us as really true. But in all of these cases, what we're relying on are the way the world presents itself to us in our various sense modalities or our various ways of coming to know the world. And I get a lot of people sort of then all of a sudden when they turn their attention to ethics or morality, they start denying things that are, that strike them as clearly true.
Do you see the phrasing there? Look at that. They start denying things that strike them as clearly true. How does he know that? How does he know that these things strike them as clearly true? That'd be one thing if people are like, yeah, it strikes me as clearly true, but I don't think it anyway. But why do realists operate under the presumption that this is the case for like, who is this the case for? Who? And like, okay, so for those people, maybe they are realists in denial. Fine. What about me? And again, if the claim is you're the outlier, prove it. How do you know I'm an outlier? How did you figure that out?
And why do they do that? Many reasons, maybe intuition, maybe perception, maybe reason, like reasoning about things make them strike us as really true. But in all these cases, what we're relying on are the way the world presents itself to us in our various.
Right. So the way the world presents itself to us differs across individuals. It doesn't present itself to us all in the same way. Or at least I have no particular reason to think it's presenting itself to me in the way it appears to be presenting itself to realists. Maybe it actually does present itself to us in the same way, and realists are just bad at phenomenology, and I'm better at it. I don't know, but I don't see any particular reason to think their interpretations of their experiences are better, or that they're having, like, in other words, they could be having the same experiences, and I'm right and they're wrong, or it could be that they're having different experiences. Either way, the presumption that we've all got the same experiences and Eric's solution or explanation of those experiences is the correct one. Why think that?
Sense modalities are our various ways of coming to know the world. And I get a lot of people sort of then all of a sudden when they turn their attention to ethics or morality, they start denying things that are, that strike them as clearly true. And why do they do that? Well, it's unclear. I guess well, actually, I'll speculate. I think that ethics is doing something very different than what science is doing. And right now we live in a time where science is like regarded as the best kind of inquiry and is the most, epistemically elite. And anything that doesn't live up to those standards is regarded as, worthless. And I think that's a mistake I love science. I think it's great. And I think we've learned a lot of things and I'm very impressed by it and all that stuff. But I mean, the way science proceeds is, as you say, relying on what strikes us as clearly true and then trying to systematize these things that strike us as clearly true and then moving to edge cases, things that are less obvious to us and trying to systematize those things. And that's all we're doing in the world of ethics as well. And I think if you were to...
Yeah, this equivalence to science is really weird. I mean, science, we end up developing tools that allow for external corroboration of our models and, our theories. Like the world gives us feedback. So how do I find out if my theories about how bridges work are correct? I build a bridge, see if it still holds up. Doctor has a new theory about how to cure a disease or perform a particular kind of surgery. People had to perform the first heart transplants. People had to perform the first surgical procedures of this or that kind. The world itself gives us feedback about whether or not our theory or our belief or our attitude or our judgment on the matter was successful or not. This happens even in really mundane cases like chess. If you think you've got a new chess opening, try it out, play against a bunch of really good players, see if it improves the ratio of games that you win. Maybe it turns out it's like really tricky and people figure out a solution pretty quickly. And so it might seem great for the first month or two, but after it gets around that you got a new opening, someone figures out how to defeat it. Now, I don't know, that's maybe not likely in chess for a new opening, but the general idea would just be that even in pretty mundane cases like that, there's a way of finding out by testing what your ideas, your beliefs, your attitudes, your thoughts, your models against the world. And then some of them work better and some of them work less well. And then you keep the ones that work and you discard the ones that don't. Works in cooking, works in sports, works all over the place. When it comes to morality, how do we find out whether our shifts in our moral attitudes are improvements? What feedback do we get? The answer is none. We don't get feedback. So philosophy is at a massive disadvantage in this case because there's no way to test it against the world. Imagine if we wanted to cook food, we wanted to get better at cooking food for a fictional species of beings that had radically different taste preferences than us? What would you do to find out if your food was better or worse? You added more salt, you add less salt. You add more umami flavor, you add less. You add it, make it sour, you don't make it sour. You serve it really hot, you serve it really cold. How do you find out which one is better? The answer is you don't, because there's no way to get feedback because the beings in question are fictional. They can't taste the food and tell you. And this is very much what these like intuitions and a priori approaches are like. There is no feedback. There's no way to find out whether you're right or not.
To keep the same methodology across domains as I think you should, I think you'd find yourself.
The same methodology. Is he claiming we use the same methodology in moral philosophy as we do in science? This is not true.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think you'd find yourself being a moral realist. That's why I am a moral realist. And that's why I think, yeah, and everything that we say is totally compatible with science. In fact, it fits quite nicely with it.
Not that.
So the intuitive faculty that he claims we have, is that compatible with science? What do you think in the chat? Is it? I suspect it might not be.
Psychological reasons should be why you favor one particular metaethic over the other. But
before we get into this, I mean, I have to go in about 15 minutes. One final note I'll make about this. Yeah, I got to go in 15. Is that, he's psychologizing about why people might be anti-realists. Note again, psychologizing. He is speculating, but is he right? Who knows? That's an empirical question. And it's not true of me. I was an anti-realist before I got super into the sciences. So it wouldn't make sense for that to be true of me. In fact, I might have been a theist at the time. I don't even remember. I became an atheist around the time I was 16. I don't remember when I became or realized I was an anti-realist, but it would have been around the same time. I don't think I'd been deeply steeped in the sciences and that somehow that caused me to be an anti-realist. I don't think that's what happened. And I don't know if that generally happens with other anti-realists. Supercritical Snake says, his characterization of science as taking, quote, what strikes us as clearly true, then trying to systemize, in brackets, those things, is totally not projection. I take it that that's sarcasm. Mason Colbert says, I work in cancer research. Very cool. That's awesome. And I work with PhDs in a number of different specializations. I can tell you firsthand that for every single different specialization, disagreement about how to interpret the data is 90% of our work. Yeah. Alex says, how does he know? He intuited it. So Noah Birnbaum says, I'm going to have to disagree. Well, here, I don't know if I said, if you don't have feedback loops, there's no way to know that something's true. At least I hope I didn't say that, but I mean, that might actually be true. I don't know. But I'm stressing a difference between science and moral philosophy, which is that you don't have this type of feedback in moral philosophy and you do have it in science. Now, someone could argue, no, you actually do have this in moral philosophy. That'd be one approach. But I don't know if I would say that feedback loops are the only way to know that things are true. I actually suspect they are, but I don't know if that's something I'm about for defending 10 minutes, 15 minutes before I'm leaving here. So you say we can certainly know if a set of axioms that don't hold to be true lead to some conclusions. What do you mean there? So you could find out, like, for instance, that if you start with some set of axioms that they end up leading to contradictions down the road. You might find that a set of axioms lead to certain surprising conclusions. You could discover really interesting things. But I don't know that you're getting feedback against the world. You're just getting feedback within a closed system. It's not the world giving you the feedback.
Are there plausible psychological reasons why you think people are attracted to or repelled from moral realism?
Yes. So let me start with repelled, and then I'll say some psychological reasons. These are not going to be flattering. So I'm not suggesting every anti-realist, these are the reasons why they reject realism. But I mean, here are some plausible ones. I mean, I think
so that's a good qualification. He's suggesting here are some reasons I think might be going on with some people. And this might be true of a lot of anti-realists. It may or may not be true of me. And so if someone's saying, hey, a lot of anti-realists are anti-realists for stupid or bad reasons, I might just agree with him about this. And it would be the same thing, like if we're talking about theists and atheists. Back in the day when I used to argue about theism and atheism, I would just cringe to the depths of my non-existent soul at the kinds of stupid shit that atheists would say when they talk to theists. Just scientifically illiterate nonsense, completely confused gobbledygook, totally just garbage, bad philosophy. There were just a lot of atheists that would just trot out just the dumbest pseudo arguments and bad reasoning in the universe. And often, if they were dealing with Christian apologists or people that really study a lot of William Lane Craig or something, those people could walk circles around some of the atheists, which you shouldn't do if I don't think William Lane Craig is very impressive at all when it comes to debating atheism or metaethics or much of anything else. But he's better than random internet atheists, so like a lot better. But that's a low bar, and a lot of them were just really embarrassing. So a lot of people probably have bad reasons for being atheists.
A lot of people, again, they regard science as like the elite epistemic sort of practice. And so they have this sort of exaggerated allegiance to science. And they think, look,
you might be right about that. I'll get back to that in a second. I want to address Noah here. So Noah says, sorry for misunderstanding. You might not misunderstand. I'm not going to say every time, this is something that a lot of people, like I think Sam Harris does this. Oh, it's so frustrating. So many people misunderstand. No, people just disagree with him. So you could just disagree with me and maybe I'm wrong. Oh, sorry. I lack intellectual humility. Never mind. I take that back. I'm right and you're wrong. It is a misunderstanding. If you don't agree with me, then you misunderstand my views, because no one could possibly understand me and disagree with me. That's sarcasm. So, okay, just to make clear, because I never know how uncharitable people are going to be. Okay, so now I'm making a claim that not only feedback is important for truth. So this would be a further discussion about what I mean by feedback and what I mean by truth. So I'm a pragmatist. I'm going to take an empiricist line on these sorts of things. And I think that the pursuit of truth is this constant, ongoing, interactive, experiential process. So I may just disagree with you. I think maybe feedback is essential for truth. But that's a discussion I have another time. They just want to send. It still happens, Lance. Shots fired at Craig. Hey, I'm not really trying to diss Craig. I don't know how good or bad his arguments are on stuff outside of metaethics, but his stuff on metaethics is it's not great. It's pretty standard metaethics stuff. I mean, I don't mean to be disrespectful. I don't even think it's his area of specialization. But I don't take his arguments for metaethics to be remotely compelling. And I wish he went up against people that would be tougher opponents. I think he had a debate with Shelley Kagan. That was pretty good.
Look, anything that's not science, throw it out. So I think that's a mistake. I also think that there's a bit of morality, and especially objective morality, sort of smacks of religion. Sounds like the kind of thing that, religious people are into.
And I wonder why. Maybe because it is. Sorry, I didn't say anything. Continuing.
And a lot of people hate religion. Religion's not cool. And it's, that's what the bigots and the losers are into. And so anything that sort of smacks of religion, they're sort of unattracted to. And so I think a lot of people.
Was that the reason why anti-realism was quite popular in the 70s or earlier?
Yeah, that is my sense, is that there's many reasons, but one was logical positivism was a big deal, and that was sort of
that seems right.
That was a sort of religion and all religions claims are kind of goofy and crazy. So that's one story, is that there was sort of an anti-religious sort of thing. And look, if you think that there are truths that are independent of our minds, but they're not physical truths, that kind of sounds religious-y. And so it's like, I'm out with that stuff.
Yeah, it sounds religiously because it sounds religious-y because it kind of is. And I'm not saying that the claims are themselves religious claims, but I do think that the provenance of the propensity or the attraction of moral realism has its roots in a long cultural heritage of, at least among analytic philosophers, the influence of Christianity, monotheism, and these sorts of sentiments in the Western world. So I actually do think that there are religious influences here. I think something Nietzschean is kind of going on, and that moral realism is the sort of last gasp or a legacy of a post-theistic secular philosophical discipline.
I think a lot of
which is to say, I do think there's something sort of quasi-religious about it, about the appeal. I don't think that's part of the conceptual content. I think it's part of the causal origins of it, if that makes sense, like the psychological draw that realists have towards it.
A lot of people sort of think that I think they misunderstand ontological simplicity. I think they think, oh, well, this is the simpler view, and so like that's a better view. But what they don't understand is that, look, appeals to simplicity are appropriate only when you have two theories and they're equally good theories, all things considered. And so it's sort of like, don't multiply entities beyond necessity. Necessity for what? Necessity for understanding the domain that you're interested in. Well, a lot of people are like, well, I'm just not even going to countenance the domain of morality. I'm just going to, for simplicity reasons, just reject it. There just is no morality at all. And I think, no, that's not a proper use of morality, of simplicity, because now you're just rejecting tons of data. That is, it seems clearly true to you and most everyone else that some actions are morally wrong.
There we have it. It seems clearly true to you. He's just making claims about how things seem to other people and to, what did he say? Almost everybody else?
If you're of simplicity, because now you're just rejecting tons of data. That is, it seems clearly
tons of data. So we got tons of data.
True to you and most.
It seems clearly true to you. No, it doesn't.
Everyone else.
And what does he say specifically? Let's get it again.
And I think, no, that's not a proper use of morality, of simplicity, because now you're just rejecting tons of data. That is, it seems clearly true to you and most everyone else.
Eric, I don't think it's true that it seems to most people that things are wrong in the sense that you appear to think that it does. If you think that, you're making a psychological claim. Please present the empirical evidence that supports that claim. This looks like a straightforward empirical claim. Most people have these kind of realist experiences. I deny this. I don't think the evidence supports this.
That some actions are morally wrong. If you're just like, well, I don't countenance them because simplicity. I guess I'd want to know, well, first of all, like you haven't even theorized the domain in the first place.
Yeah. So Sapir makes a good point here, which is he's also talking about a lot of things that could benefit from disambiguation in ambiguous ways. Yeah. So we get this whole things seem wrong. Okay, excuse my language, but what the fuck does that mean? Stance independently wrong, or wrong in some other sense, or wrong in an undifferentiated sense? What the hell does it mean to say it seems wrong? What does that mean? How does it seem? When I eat food, some of it seems tasty. Does it seem stance independently tasty? Do I need to invoke gastronomic realism to explain how it seems to me? That it seems tasty? Why, if you're talking about metaethics, would you make normative claims without qualification? Why would you do that? It seems weird. Like what? It almost seems like it's engineered to actively foster confusion. Why talk this way? What exactly is the content of these seemings? Does it seem stance independently wrong, or does it just seems wrong? Can something just seem wrong in a way that's like undifferentiated? It seems wrong, but not in a realist or anti-realist way in particular. What the hell is the content of the seeming then? What does that mean? Are we just trying to account for normative attitudes? Because we don't need realism to do that. So then why would we invoke realism to account for that? It's just weird. Why make these normative claims where the meta-ethical presuppositions that may or may not be present in them are not explicitly stated? Why do this? Oh, so frustrating. All right, this will be the last point. I'm going to have to go in like a minute or two.
And you haven't shown that realism and anti-realism are all things equal, and then you move to simplicity. Simplicity is supposed to be something like a tiebreaker for two theories.
We don't even disagree.
And a lot of people just think it's the first thing you go to.
These random empirical claims that get thrown in here, that they just make empirical claims and they present zero evidence for them. Zero evidence. Zero. It's bizarre. Hey, most people think hot dogs are sentient. If you disagree, too bad. I think they're sentient. You think they're sentient. Hey, everyone in the audience, you think hot dogs are sentient. Disagree? Tough shit. I'm just going to say that. I'm not going to present any evidence for it.
Just tell me the simpler theory. It's also a mistake because no one thinks that like the way to decide between two theories is just to count up the number of things that they posit and then the lowest number wins. Like that's a huge mistake with how to use simplicity, because again, simplicity is a principle of theory choice. And it says, look, when all things are equal, go with a simpler theory. But all things aren't equal. The realist view says that there are moral truths and that you can come to know some of them. And that's consistent with lots of the data. That is the pre-theoretical beliefs we come at.
It's consistent with lots of the data. It's consistent with the pre-theoretical beliefs we come at things with. What is the content of the pre-theoretical beliefs that it's consistent with? What's the content of that? And how did he find out what the content of that is? Who thinks this way? Who has these pre-theoretical beliefs? And how was this determined? These are psychological claims. Okay, again, I get a lot of pushback from people saying, how is the psychological data relevant to these philosophical claims? Okay, why is it that philosopher, like, these are not even philosophical claims, this is a psychological claim. And then the psychological claims are being utilized by him to make philosophical claims. But so philosophers can just make whatever psychological claims they want? Where is the data supporting this? So it's so weird. So they just get to make whatever psychological claims they want. Nobody has to check them.
When we're trying to understand.
Like, look, there. All right, I'm going to stop it there. Give me a second. There are empirical studies on this. People are actually attempting to find out what non-philosophers actually think about this stuff. So I'm going to bring up one. I probably brought it up before, but we're just going to do it again. It's just, ugh. Give me a second. Pull up this paper. Where is it? And I really got to get going. There it is. Okay. See if this is going to work. All right. Here is a graph from, well, a table from the paper, the anti-realist pluralism paper from Polsler and Wright. So what you see here are people that give consistently realist, inconsistent, and consistently anti-realist responses across two different types. There's clusters of measures. They use different sets of measures in the abstract and concrete cases. So I'll zoom in on. Oh, I could do this. All right. Now, you look at that. What Polsler and Wright found was consistently high rates of anti-realist responses. Now, I critiqued this study in my dissertation. I argue that there are significant methodological problems with the study. However, I do believe that this study provides it uses a better methodology than earlier studies. Now, does this study settle the matter? No. But what I don't see realists doing is contending with the study, explaining what their issues are with it. I've done it, even though I'm an anti-realist and I don't think most people are realists. But I don't see them doing it. Here is actual data, not whatever he's talking about when he talks about data. This is actual data. Actual data. And the actual data they found in this study was that most of the people consistently gave anti-realist responses. So does that settle the matter? No. But what the hell is going on there? Now, I could already tell you, I'll tell you some of my criticisms. There's some are more complicated methodological stuff. I got to go in a minute. Don't have time for that. But remember, I mentioned two populations that they studied, college students and people in Amazon's Mechanical Turk in the United States. Now, only about 10% of people, I think, are non-theists or something like that in the United States. The rates, the percentage is going to be pretty low. The percentage of people that report like agnosticism or atheism or non-religious beliefs among people in Mechanical Turk, there's some data showing that it might be a lot higher, like 30 to 40%. There's also a strong correlation between non-theism and giving anti-realist responses. And so that population on Mechanical Turk, at least with respect to factors that would be relevant to measuring responses here, are not representative of the US population as a whole. They're disproportionately non-religious and non-theist. And that might skew that data more in the direction of anti-realist responses. College students, you have a paper by Beebe and Sapris, Moral Relativism, I think it's called, Across the Lifespan. In that paper, they found that people in their late teens and early 20s exhibit the highest rate of anti-realist responses. So once again, you have a demographic population that's disproportionately likely relative to the population they're drawn from. You have a sample that's disproportionately likely relative to the population they're drawn from to give higher rates of anti-realist responses. In other words, people in their late teens and early 20s and people that are more likely to be non-religious are more likely to give these responses. So is this data representative of the US population as a whole? No, it almost certainly is not. What would the data actually look like if you had a representative sample? I don't know. It'd probably move more towards a higher consistent realist and inconsistent response rates than what you see here. Does that mean this data is useless and unformative? No, it doesn't mean that. But like if you want to address questions about what most people pre-theoretically believe, you got to do research. It's not something that you're entitled to just presume from the armchair. And my problem with a lot of non-naturalist realists and analytic philosophers is they're not even attempting to do this research, to engage with this research, to read this research, to discuss this research, to critique the research. They're not engaging with it at all. I mean, just imagine I went around constructing theories of personality and I refused to look at Big Five data. I refused to look at research in personality psychology. I didn't look at any of the actual data that people were utilizing. I didn't care about factor analysis. I just didn't look at any empirical data. I just made up theories about personality based on my personal experiences and anecdotes and discussions with my students. If you tried to present that data at a personality psychology conference, you get laughed out of the room, because actually figuring out what human personalities are like at a detailed and rigorous way is incredibly difficult. It requires enormous amounts of data, and people are still disputing it now. In other words, even when you use empirical tools, just figuring things out about what personality traits people have, something relatively mundane, not to say it's not interesting, is incredibly difficult. And here we have people trying to figure out complicated things about metaethics, and they think they could figure this out by thinking about it, and they don't need to do any research. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Ridiculous. You can't do psychology by just thinking about it. You have to gather data. If you're going to make claims about what people think, you have to gather data on what those people think by studying those people. Jesus Christ. See you all later.